Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. It is now some 25 years since my father rented a certain lonely back farm in Ontario, with an old-fashioned grey stone house and low-down outbuildings on it. We had heard a little about it being haunted, but my parents only scoffed at the idea of such a thing. We had become nicely settled when we began to feel there was something wrong with the place. The first thing we noticed was the noise of footsteps. Firm, heavy footsteps across the veranda. And always on opening the door as quickly as possible, we could see nothing. Immediately afterwards, the footsteps would be in the cellar. Other noises, like empty barrels being bumped, would follow. And more than once did my father go down with a lamp in one hand and a stout club in the other, thinking some intruder had found an entrance. Stories like this flooded the pages of the Toronto Star Weekly in April 1924, after the newspaper asked a simple question: do you know a haunted house in Ontario? The response was overwhelming. People wrote in describing shadowy figures appearing in the dead of night, objects moving without explanation, eerie premonitions of death, and spirits caught in a loop, repeating the same moments over and over again. These weren't carefully staged seances or parlor tricks, like we discussed in our last two episodes about spiritualism in Canada. These were uninvited encounters. At the Haunted Walk, we've spent years researching and listening to people share their paranormal experiences. And if you've been listening to Haunted Talks, you've heard these kinds of stories too. The footsteps, the shadows, the unexplained movements. But familiar doesn't mean identical. These stories are like variations on a theme, echoes of a melody played out across time. The details shift, the setting, the people, even the way the stories are told, but at their core, they share a familiar rhythm. No two stories are ever truly the same. Each one carries its own mystery, its own voice, and its own chill in the dark. In today's episode, we're stepping back in time to hear these remarkable accounts in the very words of those who lived them. But before we get to that, if you enjoy eerie stories from the past, why not step into the dark for yourself? Alone in the Dark at the Village at Black Creek returns this weekend. One of our coolest and spookiest adventures is back, where you'll use ancient and modern methods to attempt to contact the restless spirits of the village. And if you book today, the day the episode drops, Friday, February 28th, 2025, you can save $13 on tickets. But hurry, this deal vanishes at midnight. March break is also creeping closer, and while we're bracing for a little more snow this weekend, there were a few moments this week when, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the faint whispers of spring approaching. Celebrate March break with us on one of our ghost tours. Things are already starting to fill up, so now is the time to book. And let's be honest, spending time with family and friends is great, but spending time with them at a haunted location, listening to ghost stories, that's some next level bonding. Don't forget, as Haunted Talks listeners, you can use the promo code Haunted Talks, all one word, at checkout to save 15% on all your ghost tour tickets. Stay spooky with us by following @HauntedWalk on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky for ghostly updates, behind-the-scenes stories, and other eerie fun. And if you're enjoying the show, rating and reviewing it wherever you listen helps fellow ghost story lovers find us. And maybe, more importantly, it'll keep the spirits happy. We moved into a house on Ruxton Road in Toronto. My father had been working at night at the time and came in around noon. One morning, Mother complained about the hot air registers, which were in the floor, making so much noise when Dad came in. He went around and tightened them all, so there was practically no noise, except when a heavy body walked across them. The next night, Mother awoke with a start. She heard footsteps coming up the stairs, then along the hall. The register went creak, creak, the floor squeaking as well. The steps came along to the door of her room, passed over the register inside the door with a few more creaks. But there was nothing there. Only something vague and shadowy. A little black shadow which ran along the floor. Mother fainted and didn't come to until my father came home a few moments later. Several nights later, around midnight, we had all gone to bed. Father sat reading in a chair at the dining room table with his back to the kitchen door. Feeling a draft, he got up and shut the kitchen door, as it required a good pull to shut it and make the latch catch. A few minutes later, he had an uneasy feeling. Looking around, he discovered the door wide open, and a small dark shape ran along the door in front of him. The next day, he went over the house, searching from cellar to the attic for a stray cat or animal or anything that might account for it, but could not discover anything. The climax came a few days after this. My cousin came in from the country to spend a few days with us and shared my room. The house was getting settled for the night when my mother heard a movement in my room. Feeling nervous, she got us up to see if we were sick. In the meantime, I was awakened, probably by the same noise. Looking around, I discovered my cousin sound asleep. Feeling uneasy, I awakened her quietly, and we sat up in bed. At this moment, Mother from the hall and we two girls from the bed saw distinctly a shadowy shape of a man followed by a small black shadow running across the floor. Walking in from the front of the bureau, across the room, into the closed closet. We moved the next day. The odd part of the whole thing happened a month later. I was talking to a girl who lived across the street, and she told me that an old gentleman who had lived in the house before we did had been found dead in his chair in the dining room, and his little black dog running around, frantic with terror. Another reader wrote in saying he did not believe in haunted houses up to the time of this particular experience. I did not believe in warnings, he says, but I must admit that I do now. It happened during the time of the Great War, when many poor mothers and wives were receiving sad news about their dear ones far over the sea. My home was in a small town situated on the north shore of the Georgian Bay. We had a brother on active service and a cousin in the Royal Flying Corps whose photo occupied a prominent place above the piano. It had been there for 2 years without having been taken down. Then one day, we noticed it turned around with the face to the wall. It was my sister who first noticed it, and I can well remember her asking me whether I had touched it. I had never been near it, nor had anybody else in the family. I thought it was strange, but did not give the matter serious consideration until it happened the second time, when I began to think there was something unusual about the whole affair. It was about an hour after the first peculiar happening that I again went into the parlor out of curiosity and was amazed to find the same picture again turned to the wall after having been properly placed just an hour before. I thought at first that my sister or someone had been trying to play a joke on me. I watched the parlor door very carefully, but no one entered the room. I went in again and found the picture turned around for the third time. I was then convinced, and still am, that no human hands moved that picture. A few days after this strange occurrence, we received a telegram that the poor cousin whose picture had been featured in these strange phenomena had been killed in action. I will never again doubt that warnings are sometimes sent out to people who have been bereaved of their dear ones or who are about to hear some sad news. Perhaps people who read this will believe it to be foolishness, but I have only stated the plain facts, just as they happened. A Lakefield woman also believes that a warning was sent to her by means of a ghostly photograph on the wall. While a student at the university, she says, I shared a bedroom and a sitting room with a girlfriend whom I shall call May. We spent many hours in these two rooms, and the woman in whose home we roomed was most kind to us. After leaving college, our paths went in opposite directions, and it was not until several years later afterwards that I had the opportunity to visit that old city again. I had not seen May during all these years, but we had corresponded in a desultory sort of way. The time came when I could get down for a few days to see a football game, and I went at once to see our former landlady. We had an entertaining chat downstairs. The whole place seemed so familiar, and I seemed to be a schoolgirl again. She asked me to be her guest while I was in the city, and told me that my old room was waiting for me upstairs. I hurried up the well-known stairway, and on entering the room, I was surprised to see on the wall a photograph of my friend, May. No details of the frame or mounting were impressed on my mind, but the picture itself was startlingly real. I remained there for some time, gazing at it. The tilt of the head, the droop of the mouth, were so very lifelike. I could almost fancy that the lips moved, and the eyes seemed to look right into mine. How well I remembered that very expression. I wondered that I, too, had not received one of these pictures. When I went downstairs, I asked my former landlady when she had received such an excellent photograph of May. She looked at me in amazement, and on my explanation, assured me that she never had such a photo. I immediately took her upstairs to prove my statement, but no such photograph was to be found. In fact, the wall which I pointed at, as the one which I had seen the picture, proved to be entirely devoid of photograph or ornament of any kind. Naturally, there was many a joke at my expense, but the landlady and I agreed that going back to the room where May and I had been so closely associated had produced in my mind a hallucination. I had to be content with this explanation, but the feeling of something unnatural persisted. There was a different explanation when I reached home 2 days later. I found among the mail an envelope containing the notice of death of this same friend, May. It seemed she had died on the very day that I had so clearly seen her photograph on the wall. And when some time afterwards her father sent me the particulars of her death, I had to come to the conclusion that it must have occurred at precisely the same hour that I was so impressed by her likeness, and felt that she herself was in the room again. I feel still that this was her farewell to me. And when the question arises, did I see a ghost? Did I see the spirit of a deceased person? I say, assuredly, that I did. Toronto is full of haunted houses, declares another contributor. It was the month of May, 1905, that I first came to Toronto. I took a house on Wellesley Street. The number I withhold, as I do not wish to give the present occupant the heebie-jeebies. Originally, this house had been much smaller, but it had been added to very considerably. One morning, not long after I had taken possession of the home, which I only ended up staying in for 6 months, I entered the breakfast room. There, to my astonishment, I saw an old woman with her back turned towards me. She was stout and short and wore a print dress, and evidently an apron in front of her, for I could see the apron strings tied in a bow at her waist. She wore an old-fashioned cap, made apparently of some material, crimped around the face. As I entered the room, she walked away from the table with her back towards me. The position of her arms was that of a person carrying something away from the table. She passed round the end of the table, but instead of going towards the door, which was in the farther corner of the room, she passed through the center of the wall. I saw this lady on a number of occasions, but she always had her back turned towards me. The strange part of it was that her figure had a familiarity about it, reminding me of my paternal grandmother, who had been dead a number of years and who had never been out of England. On other occasions, I'd seen a number of people in the front room, downstairs. On one occasion in particular, I was sitting there alone. I had been reading, but as the light faded away, I ceased to do so. I happened to look at the door of the room when I saw the apparitions of several young men entering. My glance passed beyond them into the hallway to the staircase. There I saw a number of young ladies going up the stairs, clad in summer wraps, of which some were divesting themselves as they passed up the staircase. In a few moments, the ladies came downstairs and entered the room where I was seated. There both girls and young men mingled and commenced to dance a waltz. There was no music, and it seemed strange to see these silent, ghostly dancers waltzing around the room. A ship may not exactly be a house, but to a ship's captain, it is his only home for years at a time. It is a ship's captain, now residing in Toronto, who tells of a ghost that appeared to him on his boat. It was in the year of 1896. We were homeward bound from the west coast of South America, and after beating about for 18 days, finally got round the Horn. The second mate of our ship took very ill, and in a few days was dead. It was during the dead mate's watch that his spirit appeared to us. I happened to be in his watch. Now, during my time at the wheel, in the nighttime, the second mate used to pace up and down the bridge, and every once in a while he would stop and look over my shoulder to see that a proper course was being steered. The night of the day he died, when I was at the wheel, sure enough, the ghost of the second mate stopped behind me and looked over my shoulder. It put the usual question, "How's her head, son?" I could feel his breath, and what's more, distinctly see him walk away and disappear into nothingness. I told the new second mate what I had seen and heard, and he said that he had distinctly seen the dead man too. So what do we make of these stories? I would say it's quite interesting that most of them come from women. As we discussed in our last two episodes, women played an enormous role in the development of spiritualism in Canada, including writing down evidence and compiling stories. There's something about these particular tales that feels timeless. The shadowy figures, the unexplained movements, the premonitions of death. We still hear stories like this today. But what's most fascinating is how they take on variations, shifting slightly with time, the culture, the storyteller, and yet they always return. Paranormal investigators often talk about residual hauntings, spirits replaying the same actions over and over again, like an echo imprinted on a place. Woman in white, walking the halls. The sound of footsteps that never reach their destination. A phantom waltz, forever caught in time. But maybe hauntings aren't just tied to places, objects, or people. Maybe they're tied to the stories themselves. Every time we tell them, we bring them back to life. We repeat their patterns, pass them on, and keep the echoes alive. These ghost stories from 1924, do they belong to the past? Or do they still whisper to us, waiting to be retold? Perhaps that is how they haunt us, not as specters in a darkened hallway, but as stories that refuse to fade away. Because here we are, 100 years later, still listening, still watching those flickering shadows in the dark. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you have experienced a haunted house or a haunting of some kind, we would love to hear about it and add your experience to our files. Always feel free to reach out to me with those stories or any questions or suggestions you might have. My email address is jim@hauntedwalk.com. If you haven't listened to our two-parter on Canadian spiritualism, I would highly recommend you check it out. For information on any of our ghost tours or paranormal adventures, including those during March break, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. We would love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. And if you're enjoying the episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. It's a great way for us to know you're out there in the dark and to help other spooky folks discover the show. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.